Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you this evening as we learn more about what we breathe every day. This lecture series is made possible by the generosity of the family of Ann Ives, a science researcher who lived in Westport. Her husband, Ray, wished the Westport Library to continue educating the public about science in order to honor her legacy, and we continue to do so with pride. This evening's speaker has been hailed as, quote, the country's most respected science journalist, a Stephen Jay Gould Prize winner. He contributed to a Pulitzer Prize-winning series with the New York Times and is, to his own knowledge, the only writer after whom both a species of tapeworm and an asteroid have been named. I feel like an imposter. Carl Zimmer has written for magazines such as National Geographic, many books that have been named the best of lists like the New York Times Notable Books of the Year. He has also appeared on MSNBC, PBS, NPR, and other media outlets. He is here tonight to share information about aerobiology and his newest book, Air-Borne, The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe, which I'm sure will cause us to think a little more about how we interact with our most basic bodily functions. Copies will be available for sale and signing after the presentation. What drew me to request this author and this book was that it was described so beautifully. Weaving together gripping history with the latest reporting on COVID and other threats to global health, Air-Borne surprises us on every page as it reveals the hidden world of air. So without further ado, Mr. Zimmer.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming out. So I want to tell you about this book I've just written, which what I hope will be is an introduction to a hidden world, an ecosystem that is all around us, the atmosphere. And you might not think of the atmosphere as being alive, but in fact, it is. And there are really countless numbers of organisms that are all floating all around us, all the way up to the stratosphere. And this is actually a really important discovery for understanding the natural world and also understanding our own health. And in this book, I go through this history, which is a really remarkable history that I was kind of surprised really hadn't been told in this sort of format. And there are familiar people. There's Louis Pasteur, there's Charles Darwin, people like that. But then there are also people who you might not recognize. These are lost pioneers. We like to think about science is just a simple march of progress. Things move forward. Someone makes a discovery. Everyone says, that's great, wonderful. Now we all move on, and we remember their accomplishments. The fact is that this husband and wife team of William and Mildred Wells made incredibly important discoveries that unfortunately were then forgotten. Discoveries about the air and about how diseases can move through the air. And to give you a sense of why they were so important and why it was so unfortunate that they got forgotten, I just want to show you a quick graph. I want to remind you a little bit about what we've just gone through. We are now observing the 5th anniversary of the COVID pandemic. I won't say celebrating, because it was and continues to be a really harrowing experience. There's no other way to describe it. Within the United States, about 1.2 million people have died of COVID. Worldwide, it's harder to get a good estimate. The official estimate is something over 7 million, but probably, some estimates put it at over 27 million people. So that makes it the worst pandemic of its kind since the 1918 flu pandemic. But here's another set of disturbing numbers, and they have to do with tuberculosis. You don't think of tuberculosis as a pandemic that's shutting down the world, but the fact is that tuberculosis is a huge burden on global health. In fact, last year alone, it killed 1.25 million people in 2023, I should say. Now, there are a lot of differences between COVID and tuberculosis. COVID's caused by a virus, tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, but they do have something in common, which is that they're both airborne. And when I say that they're airborne, what I mean is that people can spread it through the air so that other people can inhale it, a little bit like smoke. If I were to be smoking here, you might breathe in some of that smoke over there. And this has a huge significance for how you deal with a disease. If a disease is like this, you're going to treat it very differently than if it's spread, say, just by contact. And although it's been 5 years, I don't know about you, but I vividly remember, washing down my groceries. Because initially, that was what people, including public health experts, were thinking was one of the main ways that COVID spread. And you had the World Health Organization coming out and just saying emphatically, COVID is not airborne. And this was actually kind of the seed for my book because, eventually it became clear that COVID is airborne. And I just thought, well, how did this happen? Why was this so challenging to figure out? And when I would talk to scientists themselves about this, they'd say, well, really, you have to understand history. One scientist put it to me this way, he said, history set us up. And among the people that I discovered when I started to explore this history were people like William and Mildred Wells, who I had not heard of before. So just to kind of put their work and how important they are into context, I just want to sort of take you back a little further in time. So, thousands of years ago, people did not know that there was oxygen and nitrogen in the atmosphere, but they knew that the air mattered. The Greeks considered it one of their 4 elements. People knew that you had to breathe. There was something about the air that was required for life. And yet there was something a little sinister about the air too. Sometimes it would smell a little funny, or you might have a dust storm that would come through. And this helped lead to a view that the air itself could become corrupted, and that could cause disease. So that if a whole lot of people in a city, for example, suddenly all got the plague at once, that must be because they all breathed the same bad air, what Hippocrates called miasmas. And Hippocrates developed this very elaborate idea about miasmas. There were different miasmas for different diseases, and other species could get their own miasmas and their own diseases. And this was an incredibly powerful idea. It really held on to Western thought for thousands of years. So, in the 1800s, well after the scientific revolution, well past the Age of Enlightenment, when cholera arrives in Europe, this is how people envision it. You see those clouds there, this sort of like this giant monster spreading across, marching across the land. Well, the issue here was that, again, cholera was believed to be caused by contaminated air. that somehow there was something wrong about the air. So if you breathed it in, that you would get sick. And there were all sorts of theories about what could do that. So maybe it was like garbage on the street. Maybe it was very hot weather or humid conditions or electricity in the air. But it was all about the air. Now, there were people at the time who said, no, cholera is caused by some kind of microbe. It's a contagious disease that's spread by microbes. Because people had discovered microbes looking through microscopes in the 1600s. And so there were these people, they were sometimes called the contagionists, and they would try to say cholera and other diseases are spread by microbes. And all of the leading experts said, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. That's pure imagination. Where's your proof? And the fact is that, in the 1830s, like the proof was kind of sketchy. Certainly there was no one who could say, like, here's one species of bacteria and it causes this particular disease. No one could do that. And so this idea that miasmas or somehow, the air itself could cause diseases like cholera or malaria or yellow fever or influenza or tuberculosis and so on, that really was quite locked in place. But, in the 19th century, scientists really got serious about understanding the microbial world. One of my favorite figures in all this work is another sadly forgotten person, Gottfried Christian Ehrenberg, who he traveled all around Africa and Siberia and all sorts of places, and the kind of life that really amazed him the most were microorganisms. And so, he realized, for example, that, the White Cliffs of Dover are, limestone rock and so on, are actually the skeletons of microbes. He is the person who actually coined the word bacteria for one group of these microbes. And so this was very, very important to help to sort of get scientists to think about, well, how do we recognize individual microbes and start to think about disease. What's also interesting is that Ehrenberg also believed that in addition to there being lots of microbes in the water and lots of microbes in the soil, he was firmly convinced that there were lots of microbes in the air. He didn't have any direct proof of this, but he just reasoned that it must be possible for all these microbes to go from the ground up into the air. And actually, Charles Darwin actually gave him some dust that he had collected in the middle of the Atlantic, and it turned out that dust contained microbes that had come from somewhere on land. So here was another indirect clue. I mentioned Louis Pasteur before, and you may think of Louis Pasteur as inventing vaccines or helping with the germ theory of disease. But Pasteur actually was one of the most important things he did in his career was actually to search for the germs in the air, airborne life. He even climbed a glacier with flasks, and he would wave the flasks around over his head, waiting for bacteria to fall down a long glass neck into some sterile broth. I imagine like a tourist who came by him in the Alps would think, this person is insane. But the fact is that, and in fact, if he had told them what he was doing, I think they'd be more convinced that he was insane. There was actually a journalist at the time who told Pasteur, the world in which you're trying to lead us, this world where we're surrounded by floating germs, is too fantastic to believe. So it was very hard to get people to think about life in the air. However, that germ theory of disease, the contagionists' idea about disease, that actually won out. So for example, with cholera, it became clear that there was a particular kind of bacteria and it spread in water. And so people who ingested contaminated water, they could also get cholera. And then they had diarrhea, and that cycle is completed. So there was an outbreak in 1892 in Hamburg, and for the first time, Robert Koch actually said, we're going to treat this like a germ, and we're going to stop this thing. So they brought in clean water, they disinfected houses, and they were able to rein in this outbreak. And the same thing happened here, not that far from here in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1892. A microbiologist named William Sedgwick was brought in to deal with an outbreak of typhoid. And again, at the time, a lot of people thought that was caused, still in 1892, a lot of people were saying, oh, we had a really bad winter, and so the air is, not quite right. And he said, no, we've actually found the species of bacteria that causes typhoid. And he was able to show that upriver from Lowell, there was sewage going into the river, and Lowell was getting its drinking water downriver from there. So Lowell essentially said, like, hey, how about we not do that? So the city of Lowell started drilling wells, and they didn't have to deal with typhoid anymore. This is the kind of, like, in hindsight, to us it seems obvious, but it wasn't. This was an idea that stuck around for centuries, and getting people to start recognizing that diseases like cholera and typhoid are spread in water saved a huge number of lives. So Sedgwick goes to MIT, and there he is, in the early 1900s, he is wanting to train an army of what he called sanitarians. He would wave around a tube of water and say, like, I've got enough bacteria that cause typhoid here to kill thousands of people. He would terrify his students, and then he'd say, but you're going to help me to save their lives. So something really interesting happened because people like Sedgwick now basically felt like, well, we've got bacteria in the water, we've got bacteria in spoiled food, we've got bacteria that are spread through sex, we've got pathogens that are spread in mosquitoes. I don't think we need to worry about the air. Let's not worry about the air, because we're convinced that diseases spread are caused by microbes, and we don't think that microbes are really in the air. And Sedgwick, himself actually did try to look for germs in the air himself. He built this device he called an aerobioscope, and he took it to Boston City Hospital. One of his students would open it up. It was had a little vacuum seal. You'd open it up, and then air would rush in. And then they had some medium, basically bacteria food, and they would see if they could grow colonies inside there. And inside of a hospital, they didn't really find much that was different than what they found outside, and they just said, it doesn't really matter. They brushed it away. Down in Providence, Rhode Island, the person in charge of public health in that city was Charles Chapin, and students would come down from MIT to spend time with Chapin, and Chapin was becoming like the leader of public health. And a lot of our way we deal with public health today was really laid down by Chapin. And Chapin was really adamant that we didn't have to worry about the air. And he even wrote, it will be a great relief to most persons to be freed from the specter of infected air, a specter which has pursued the race from the time of Hippocrates. So just not worrying about the air was really a way of, letting go of those old superstitions, because we've got science now. Now, the fact is that even at this time, people knew that there were things that floated in the air, and that there were some things that could cause a lot of harm. The problem is that, a lot of this work was happening on farms, because fungi will send up spores, and there are certain kinds of fungi, like black stem rust. If it lands in a wheat field, it can wipe it out. It can completely destroy it. And they move between wheat and this plant here called barberry in this cycle. Nobody quite knew how far those spores could travel, but clearly they were airborne. The cause of, say, you may have, the Irish famine, which was caused by potato blight, that was also caused by a disease that could spread long distances through the air as well. But again, those were plants, and somehow, the medical world, the public health world, didn't really think about humans that way. So that brings me to William Wells, this person I hope you'll remember after my talk is done today. So Wells studies under Sedgwick, and he really felt like he was Sedgwick's soldier. He once wrote that Sedgwick strove to inspire us for the coming battles which lay ahead, those battles to bring the germ theory of disease to the world and to save lives. And so he is studying water, and he's studying typhoid. I mentioned that before. And actually, it's not just drinking tainted water that can give people typhoid, because the fact is people at the time loved oysters. And oysters just sit in the water, and they just filter it all day long. And if there's sewage coming by, they'll just take up the bacteria that cause typhoid. And if you eat a raw oyster, you may die of typhoid. And an amazing number of people in the early 1900s were dying of typhoid from oysters. So he's studying, how do the oysters get typhoid? He figured out ways to purify oysters. He was doing all of this stuff. He meets Mildred Wells, who I'll talk about later. They have a child. And everything seems to be going pretty well. And then World War I breaks out, or the United States enters World War I. And so Wells is sent to Camp Meade in Maryland. These are camps that are being thrown up very quickly, and lots of people are being crowded in there. And the water supply for thousands of men in Camp Meade is this muddy little creek. This is a great way to make a bunch of soldiers sick. However, here's Wells with the germ theory of disease. He has a truck that he uses where he can disinfect the water and keep them safe. And he is then sent to France, where he continues to give clean water to the soldiers. So he probably is saving many lives. However, many soldiers are still dying all around him. They're dying of the flu, which is not spread in contaminated water. No one's 100% sure how the flu is spreading. They don't even know that it's caused by a virus in 1918. But in any case, it's horrific. So more soldiers go to the hospital with the flu than get wounded on the battlefield. And then pretty soon it spreads to civilians. 50 to 100 million people, it's estimated, died in the 1918 flu pandemic, including Wells's sister while he was away in France. So this was a very haunting experience for him, and it's possible that he really thought later, how did we fail? We were supposed to be saving people's lives, and we failed because here was something that was spreading in some sort of mysterious, really fast way. How was it spreading? Well, the war ends, and William Wells comes back, and now he gets a full-time job in New York State, studying oysters. And he actually works just right across Long Island Sound here. He is now really working aggressively, trying to figure out how am I gonna save people from these oysters, basically. This is a cartoon from the St. Louis Dispatch, where basically just talking about just a big epidemic of tainted oysters in Chicago, New York. People are just keeling over left and right. I'm amazed that they kept eating these oysters. But Wells was convinced, look, I can try to purify these oysters, and I can rebuild these stocks of oysters that are dying because of pollution and so on. But in order to grow these oysters, he's got to grow them from tiny larvae in water, and the water gets a little dirty, and he wants to move these tiny larvae into clean water, and he gets this idea that he can use a cream separator. So this is something where you pour the milk on the top, and you spin it around in there, and the cream would be flung out to the sides, and you could collect the cream and then the milk would be separated. So he just puts in water with oyster larvae in them, spins it, and the oysters, get flung to the side. They don't get killed, fortunately. And now he can collect the oyster larvae and put them in fresh water. And it works great. Things are going great. And I know you're wondering, why is he talking so much about oysters? But there's a point to this. So here's an article in the New York Times talking about working in Bayville with this hatchery. Things are going great. It's going to save the oyster industry, which is being slammed by pollution. And this is from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It shows this huge mound of oysters that, that he had actually released into the Sound. He starts being called the oyster godfather. And people are very excited that he's going to maybe create a sort of a new super race of oysters, because he's actually going to start breeding them. It's all very exciting until the Great Depression comes. And then suddenly the oyster company that he's working for goes out of business and he's out of a job. And it appears, just based on my research, looking at archives, letters and so on, the Wells were never, there's no biography ever written of them. It appears that Mildred Wells got a job. So Mildred Wells had been trained as a doctor, which was very unusual. She went to the University of Texas, graduated in 1915. This is the only picture I've ever found of her yearbook. She spent a lot of her time raising their son, who probably had schizophrenia or some other related disorder, just judging from the medical records at the time. But in any case, she got a job studying polio. She was invited to basically participate in writing a big book on polio, which at the time was this terrifying thing. Nobody knew what caused it. It would just suddenly show up like a specter, and suddenly kids were getting paralyzed and dying. It was the parents' worst nightmare. So she does epidemiology. So she looks at how polio cases rise and fall through the seasons. She looks at how you can trace them from case to case. And along the way, she develops this idea. She thinks, I think maybe that essentially this is airborne. She speculates it is conveyed from the sick to the well by these secretions from people's mouths, primarily through infective droplets sprayed about in talking, breathing, coughing, etc. Now, someone like Chapin, who I just told you about, they were like, no, that's not how polio spreads. They were just convinced of that you couldn't just talk and give someone polio. That was not possible because it wasn't airborne. So she and her colleagues published this book, and it really kind of lands with a thud. And I think the reason is that all of the co-authors were women. And I'm not just sort of speculating on that. I mean, the New England Journal of Medicine actually gave them a very backhanded compliment when they reviewed the book. They said, no one is better fitted than a woman to collect data such as this book contains. And they really didn't but they just said there's not really anything in here that a doctor can use. It's not much help. So this idea of hers really went ignored, except by her husband. So William finally gets a job at Harvard. It sounds very impressive, but it's not. He is a low-level instructor. He gets paid barely anything, and he's a terrible teacher. I found notes this is something that he just does really badly. So he can't teach. Part of the problem is he's just very preoccupied with his own thoughts. He wants to be a great scientist. He wants to be like William Sedgwick, his hero. And he gets this idea when he's looking at a picture of that aerobioscope. It's hanging in his office. They put him in an office, and it happens to have this picture there. And he's looking at it, and he's thinking, this is not a very good way to look at what's in the air. And so he kind of wonders, well, what might be a better way of collecting things from the air? Think about it. We are breathing, thousands of times a day. And so even very low levels of bacteria or viruses, we could inhale them. So you need something that's more sensitive. And it occurs to him, because in a way, we're kind of like oysters, except that like we are sort of oysters of the air. And he thinks back, speaking of oysters, to that cream separator. This is actually literally what happened. He thought, oh, I can use centrifugal force on air too. So he creates this amazing thing that came to be known as the Wells Air Centrifuge. And he invents it in the early 1930s. And basically there's a cylinder that goes on, a glass cylinder that goes on that sort of central shaft. It goes into a box and you spin it. It's powered with electricity. And a fan pulls up air and the air comes up through there. And as the air spinning around inside of the glass cylinder, if there are droplets or particles, they get flung to the side and they can stick to the side. And if you coat it with food that bacteria like, they'll grow. And it actually works. So, you know, the people at Harvard thought he was crazy, this isn't gonna work. Someone even bet him it wasn't gonna work. And then things started growing in it. It worked. And so what he realized was he was catching a lot of things in the air. Like he would go around Boston with 2 of his students and they would collect stuff from movie theaters and stores and so on. Not as much outside, which was interesting. And so he's like, well, how does this work? So in the basement of this building at the Harvard School of Public Health, there was this giant tank from World War I. And this was a tank that they used to figure out how to make gas masks to protect soldiers from chemical weapons. So they'd fill that with deadly gas, and they would run experiments. They wouldn't be inside there themselves, of course. So it was this magnificent drum, and you could just put stuff in there and study it. So what he decides to do is he says, like, let me spray droplets of water that are mixed with bacteria or viruses, and let's see how long they float in there. And let me try to collect them with the air centrifuge. And he's able to collect them after hours, sometimes even days. They're just floating around in there. And he works out the physics. So basically, like, as I'm talking to you, you know, you don't see me spewing out big droplets, right? I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm not gonna do a spit take here. I am gonna drink. But the thing is that even while I'm talking to you, I am releasing huge numbers of tiny droplets of water. Some of them are being lifted from my airway by my vibrations in my vocal folds. Some of them are just coming out of my lungs. You're releasing them too. We're all releasing them. And if they're small enough, they're going to float. And even if they're fairly big, they may have time to evaporate until they're small enough to float as well. So here was the beginnings of a theory of airborne infection. Here's the seed of, like, this is how you can have not a miasma, but floating germs spreading diseases. This idea really does start to take off. So in New York, scientists take the centrifuge onto New York City subways and they find lots of bacteria there. And again, many more than out in Central Park. There's something about these enclosed spaces where people are breathing and they're releasing their own bacteria or viruses into the air. In this picture that I showed you before, you see that glowing thing there on the left? That's an ultraviolet lamp. Wells said to himself, if these things are floating around, can I disinfect the air in the way that, you know, Sedgwick and others were coming up with ways to disinfect water, to keep water safe? I want to keep the air safe. How could I do that? And he tries lots of different things, and he discovers that ultraviolet light is really good at knocking these things out. And so he starts to run experiments where he puts influenza viruses in that tank and shoots ultraviolet light at it, and he finds that those viruses are disabled. So he publishes a paper on this, and this is a real sensation. These are some of the articles that come out after that. People are starting to imagine, you know, I think that we are going to be able to use ultraviolet lamps just, you know, placed around strategically, and that will keep us safe from things like influenza. Now, there are hospitals in the 1930s that follow Wells's discovery, and they actually install ultraviolet lights so that as air is moving through a hospital, it doesn't bring bacteria or viruses to the wards where there are babies who are very vulnerable. There are even trains. This is a photograph of a train car on a train line in Maine. They would install ultraviolet lights on the ceiling to keep people safe from this air that they were all sharing. So this is a really, this is an exciting time for discovering what's in the air. And in the book, I also talk about other people at the same time who were doing similar things. So Fred Meyer was actually, he was trying to figure out, for example, I told you about the wheat stem rust. He was trying to figure out, well, how high does stem rust or other things go? How far do they travel? So he would do these crazy things where he would get into these airplanes and these open cockpits, and he made these wooden handles with petri dishes stuck on them, and he would just lean out and just try to catch stuff. And the pilots just thought he was insane. But he would bring them back to his lab at the Department of Agriculture, and he would grow things because he had caught them. And so he was able to demonstrate that the air is rife with life. And so he did it on his own on these flights. He talked Charles Lindbergh into helping him, catching things over the Atlantic. He even put his probes on a balloon that went, or two balloons that went up to the stratosphere. And he was able to show that life could survive in the stratosphere under unbelievably harsh conditions. And this really blew people's minds. This was in 1935. The question is like, you know, how high can life go? How big is this ecosystem that would eventually be called the aerobiome? And what's really amazing is that Fred Meyer, he brings together lots of people. He probably was in some contact with William Wells, and they actually, the government agreed to sort of create, you could think of it as sort of a national weather service, but for life in the air. This was all set up and ready to go. The money was all set in place. And Fred Meyer, at the end of the meeting where they all agreed to this, he said, we've created a new branch of science. And he named the science. They called it aerobiology. So suddenly we had the science of aerobiology. Unfortunately, aerobiology did not take off the way it should have. And again, you know, science does not progress in the straight line that we think it does. Fred Meyer died shortly after in a plane crash. And then the Wellses actually, you know, they got fired from Harvard because basically no one could stand them. So they landed on their feet at the University of Pennsylvania, fortunately. And there they tried to kind of rebuild and try to do some new stuff. And they did some really impressive new experiments there. And you know, one of the most impressive of them was that Wells built a device called the infection machine. And this is what it looks like. There's a bell jar, and you can put animals in there. So now you can actually like test, can animals get sick if they inhale floating germs? And yes, indeed, they can. In fact, if you would put droplets with more flu viruses or tuberculosis bacteria in the air, more of them would die. They would get more severe disease. So you could dial it up and down very precisely. And on top of this, Mildred Wells was running an experiment of her own at schools in Philadelphia. So that thing up there is an ultraviolet lamp. So she would put these lamps in these schools, and she was convinced that they would protect kids from disease. And in fact, in 1940, there was a huge outbreak in Philadelphia of measles. You know, that name might sound familiar. And it turns out that the Wellses protected their school with these ultraviolet lamps. That one school had very low rates of measles compared to other parts of the city. So this demonstrated not only that measles was airborne, but that you could stop it in midair. So, great, okay, now that's gonna be locked down, now everyone's gonna accept this, right? Well, no. In fact, what happened was that World War II came. And World War II was very hard on the Welleses because they were hoping that they could do some of these experiments on a huge scale by showing that they could protect soldiers in their barracks with ultraviolet light, that these were airborne diseases and they could protect them. And so if there was another 1918 pandemic, they could stop it. That was their goal. And nobody wanted to let them do it. They were sort of on the edges of the research that was going on at the time during the war, and basically they got shut out. Part of it had to do with the fact that William Wells was a real, he was a real monologuist, you could say. He loved to talk and talk and talk, and he would get more agitated when people didn't understand what he was saying. You may have met this type. And so there are these notes from people who just said, like, after a while, I just couldn't take listening to him anymore. And so it's quite tragic because they didn't have this opportunity to really demonstrate their theory on a big scale. And what's really crazy is that actually the Army was actually using William Welles's ideas. They were using his infection machine. They were using all sorts of things that he and other aerobiologists had come up with. But they were doing it secretly, and they were doing it to make biological weapons. They wanted to make things like anthrax bombs. And they realized that the best kind of biological weapon is an airborne one. So they were secretly at Camp Dietrich working on this stuff, and Wells didn't even know about this until after the war. He was horrified to see what had happened to his science. He was trying to save people's lives, and here were people building weapons. Well, by the end of the war, the Welleses' marriage was pretty much over. They never got divorced, but everyone kind of knew that they were on the outs. They weren't. Mildred resigned from the lab at Penn, and actually Wells just became so difficult to work with that Penn just said, "You're gone." So he got fired a second time. But they were still on a mission. Each of them tried one more time separately to really drive home the idea that diseases were airborne and that we could help people by protecting the air. Mildred Wells wrote in a letter in 1947, "I believe that a provision of pure air for children and adults to breathe should be looked upon of equal importance to the provision of pure water and pure milk." Just real quickly, I want to make sure I have time for questions from y'all. She goes to Westchester, New York. Again, not far from here. Because the person in charge of public health there is open to an idea she has. She doesn't want to just put in ultraviolet lamps in one school. She wants to put in ultraviolet lamps in a whole town, or at least as many public spaces as she can. So in Pleasantville, New York, they do it. So in churches, in the train station, in soda shops, movie theaters, everywhere, they're putting in ultraviolet light. And the hope is that they can protect people from disease. It works, kind of. There are, certain diseases where it looks like the rate is lower in Pleasantville compared to a town nearby that doesn't have ultraviolet light. But people were so sort of focused away from airborne infection at this point. They really kind of brushed off the wells, and so it really didn't work. It didn't have the effect that she had hoped for, or that her husband William had hoped for. So she basically, that's it for her. That was the last study that she did, and she dies in 1957 at the age of 65. This is the only obituary anybody gave to her, a small newspaper in Wilmington, Delaware, where she lived at the time with their son. And again, like I said, that's the only picture that apparently was ever published of her yearbook picture. As for William, when Mildred died, he was in the middle of his last great experiment, and he chose tuberculosis. So I told you about how many people died of tuberculosis. This is not a new disease. This has been a bane of existence for centuries. And poor people get it, rich people get it, but it takes years to grind people down and to destroy their lungs. This is a picture just to illustrate the devastation, or two pictures, I should say. Claude Monet took a picture of painted a picture of his wife Camille when she was young, and then when she was dying of tuberculosis. So this is a disease of the lungs. There were a lot of people who came to believe that the way that tuberculosis spread was that people were coughing and they would spit, because it generates a lot of phlegm. So people would spit, and it would spit on the ground, and then it would get into the dust, and the dust would get kind of stirred up, and then maybe you might inhale it. So it's not really airborne in the sense that it's down in the dust. So if you could just keep people from spitting, the idea was you could stop tuberculosis. So when you see these signs that say no spitting, these came about because of a theory of tuberculosis, a theory that turns out to be wrong. And it was William Wells who showed that it was wrong. In the 1950s, he and his former student, Richard Riley, who is now a professor at Johns Hopkins, they found a Veterans Administration hospital in Baltimore where they agreed to let them run an experiment now that involved people. There was a ward at the top of the hospital building, and they set this aside, they sealed the windows and sealed the doors so that the patients there who had tuberculosis would be breathing it into the air. And they set up this venting system so that the air would go to the floor above where they were running an experiment. This is a picture of that experiment, and in that little cylinder there, they would keep guinea pigs. Yeah, guinea pigs get tuberculosis the way we do, and so Wells made a very precise prediction that a certain number of guinea pigs every year would get sick with tuberculosis if he was right. And they did start getting sick at the rate that he predicted. And then they even put ultraviolet lights in there, and the guinea pigs didn't get sick. Now this should have been, Wells's crowning moment, but at this point he's quite old. He develops prostate cancer. It spreads to his spine. He collapses at home. His son has to be institutionalized, and he is suffering a sort of psychosis. He goes in and out of psychotic states because of the cancer as well. So he has to go be put in a hospital. The nearest, and since he's a soldier, a veteran, he can go to the VA. And the nearest VA hospital is this hospital. So he's in a bed while overhead his experiment is playing out and showing that he's right. And he dies there in that hospital. I wish I could say and this is where everything got sorted out right. And this is where people realized that the Wellses were right. That didn't happen. There was a very famous infectious disease expert named Ronald Hare who gave a lecture just a month after he died, and he talked about how diseases spread. And he really took special effort to single out Wells and say he's wrong, despite the contentions of Wells, because Wells was very contentious. It is extremely doubtful whether droplet nuclei play an important part in the transmission of respiratory infection. So this was kind of science's eulogy for Wells, forgotten. I'll just wrap up now. I will say that Wells was forgotten and was to a large extent rediscovered during the COVID pandemic, because there were a small group of scientists who were keeping Wells's memory alive, and they said, folks, this disease seems to be spreading in a way that Wells had predicted. And it's true, like this coronavirus, it spreads in droplets. And now scientists can study these droplets at an atomic scale in a way that Wells could only have dreamed of. And it does seem that, that this is how this virus and perhaps lots of other diseases get around. And so, you know, so hopefully this insight is going to we're not going to forget this. Now, what does that mean for you personally? I mean, what it means for you is like you should be aware of the air. I mean, you're breathing in lots of things all the time. Most of them don't kill you. Some of them can. So how can you be aware of, you know, what risk you might have? Well, you know, this is a nice thing to have. This is a carbon dioxide meter, because we're all exhaling carbon dioxide. You know, if the level gets up like above 1,200, 1,500, you know, you're in a room that doesn't have a lot of ventilation. This is at 873. That's good. That's good, because we're in a big space. There aren't a whole lot of us here, relatively speaking. So, you know, this is a relatively safe space for when it comes to not getting a disease like COVID. This is a picture of a new kind of ultraviolet lamp. These are still being designed and developed, and that could have a lot of promise, among other things, for keeping these indoor spaces clear. But you know, we are facing more diseases that where we need to be bearing the Wells' messages in mind. We're dealing with bird flu right now, which has gotten into cows in the United States, as well as house cats. And we're looking at a real possibility that this virus could evolve into a respiratory disease that infects humans and spreads from human to human through the air. And there are scientists right now who are trying to study this. You know, there's still lots of basic questions, like with the flu, exactly how it is that it spreads through the air versus other means. They have fancier equipment now to catch viruses in the air, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And not only do we have this dangerous new virus on the loose in the United States, but we have a lot of scientists who are studying these things who are not actually sure if they're going to be able to continue doing it right now. I can say from personal experience, conversations, that there are many, many scientists who do this kind of research who are looking at how the government is handling the support for this research, and they're not sure if it's going to be happening at all coming up. They will be out of jobs. They will be closing down their labs. That's how serious these things are. So, this is not easy science, and I think the story of the Wells shows that. And so it's not going to happen on its own. And so as we go forward, in order to stay safe, I think we have to bear that message of the Wells in mind, that the air is worth thinking about. So thank you so much, and happy to take questions.
If you have a question, we are going to ask that you bring yourself over to this microphone so that those watching on the live stream and in the recording can hear you.
Hello, thank you. That was very, very interesting.
Great.
You started your talk talking about the World Health Organization not declaring COVID as airborne, and
Yes.
you said you might mention why it took them so long. I read that there was something like 200 scientists that wrote letters to them, and they finally declared it airborne. Could you explain why it took them so long?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why did it take the World Health Organization so long? So just to remind you, so in March 2020, they are saying explicitly on Twitter, on camera, elsewhere, COVID is not airborne. I mean, you can't be clearer than that. And it's really about 2 years before they have like really clear-cut language that they're putting forward saying, hey, COVID's airborne. Why did it take so long? And I think, as I said at the beginning, part of the reason is history set us up. In other words, there was just a feeling that people had that that most diseases could not spread through the air like smoke. There were a lot of misunderstandings about these droplets I was telling you about. A lot of people thought that, well, only the tiniest of tiny droplets can spread airborne disease, and so therefore, we don't have to worry about them for the most part. I mean, these are basic sort of physics mistakes. And when physicists started to get involved with these questions, they said, this doesn't make sense. And so I think there was a conflict between the public health community and the epidemiologists, and then physicists and people who were studying, life in the air, like, life that comes out of the ocean, for example. There was this clash, and it was really unfortunate that it took so long. Things have actually changed a lot. I mean, now the World Health Organization has all sorts of information on airborne disease, and they're supporting research on making models to figure out, what are the steps we can take to keep the air safe. It just took a very long time, and it was really unfortunate. We should have been ready to go at the outset because, again, this stuff is, it's like it was 90 years old at the time.
Oh, that's bright. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about the aerobiome that you were talking about. I know there's been a ton of study about gut biome in the last couple of years. It's really been some groundbreaking information in science, in the science literature. Is that going to be the same with the lung biome or the aerobiome, or do you hope so?
It might. So when the term the aerobiome, when scientists use that, it was a term that was invented and coined in 2015, I believe. And that just refers to all of the life floating in the air. So, birds, insects, viruses, algae, whatever's up there. Whatever's not pinned down to the ground or in the water, it's the aerobiome. And so you can think of it as the biggest biome, the biggest sort of living habitat around. It's bigger than the oceans. Life is much more spread out than on land or in the oceans, but it's still really important. Now, when you hear the term microbiome, that usually refers to all the viruses and bacteria and fungi that live in us or on us. I've written a lot about those in the New York Times. And what's interesting is that traditionally, scientists assumed that the lungs were sterile, that there was nothing in there. And that was mainly just because it's, let's put it this way. Let's just say, it's pretty easy to know what lives in your gut. You just wait for someone to come out of the bathroom, okay? I'll leave it at that. Whereas, if you want to know what's in the lungs, you have to, stick something down there. It's not fun. So, So it took a lot of technological developments to actually get to the point where people could really study what's in the airway really deep down. And yeah, the lung has lungs, your lungs have fungi in them and viruses in them and bacteria in them that are not making you sick. You're fine. You have a nice co-evolved relationship with them. You have lots of things in your nose and tons of things in your mouth and in your throat as well. And where do these things come from? Well, some of them you breathe in. You breathe them in, and then they just say, I like this place, and they just stay. And sometimes you exhale them, and other people pick them up. So this I would say, kind of when it comes to the human microbiome, this is one of the last frontiers. And there are a lot of interesting studies. Maybe when we talk about how fresh air is really good for us, maybe it's because if you're in the forest, you're breathing in a different diversity of species than if you're in a city. You can measure the differences, and there's some people who are exploring whether certain kinds of certain parts of the aerobiome are actually good for us as opposed to other ones.
I actually have a couple different questions. The book is about history, but do you happen to, in the book, go into physically certain things that are in the air molecules? I'm interested in, you had some diagrams up there of bacterium and so forth. So I'm curious about that, if that's in the book. And secondly, different question, Do air purifiers in your home, those things you plug in, I'm kind of curious if that has been looked at in this thing for people inside air purifiers.
Great, yeah, so in answer to the first question, yeah, I mean, I bring the book up to date with the latest science, not just on COVID, but on this more sort of environmental approach, and scientists who are like, you know, trying to figure out what are in, you know, what's in the air. Is it fungal spores, spores of plants, pollen, and so on, but also droplets that come out of the ocean, for example, dust that's coated in bacteria. That's all up there, and what is it doing? So, for example, the clouds are full of bacteria. They're, you know, a cloud will have 1 trillion bacteria in it, easy, and they seem to be growing slowly. So apparently they can eat clouds, and then yeah, it's wild. And then these microbes actually are able to sort of pull water molecules around them, such that they can trigger raindrops. In other words, they may help to make it rain. And some people even speculated that plants have lots of bacteria growing on them so that they can send them up into the atmosphere and bring rain down so that the plants can grow. Air purifiers, yes. So air purifiers, yes, they can be very effective at removing you know, not just, you know, droplets that might have COVID in them, but mold and other things in the air. There's no question that they can help. There are lots of different ways to improve your air. Just simply opening the window if the weather's nice, which hopefully will be soon, that's enough. But, you know, in your situation where that's not going to work, maybe UV, maybe air purifiers. There are a lot of potential solutions. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was great. My question is, because some of this is not necessarily new, but almost like we're starting over with things of like the idea of air pollution and stuff. Have there been any studies or any work looking into how air pollution may affect some of the air biome in terms of something like maybe making some of the bacteria that's harmful for us worse?
Yeah.
Or how it just affects things like that?
Yeah, great question. Air pollution, you know, in terms of what comes out of the back of our tailpipes or coal-fired plants or so on, that is a huge topic as well. You know, millions of people worldwide die of air pollution every year, so it's a huge problem on its own. And it does seem to change the air biome, partly because like it changes the conditions in the air so that certain species do better than others. And not only that, but when people are exposed to a lot of air pollution, that can weaken their airway, and that can make them at greater risk for a number of infectious diseases. So yeah, the interplay between air pollution and the aerobiome is a really important one. So are wildfires. You know, we remember, you know, we saw the news of the wildfires in Los Angeles, and we had, you know, the smoke coming from Canada not that long ago. Wildfire smoke shoots up huge numbers of microbes into the air. You'd think they would burn them, but no, they just pump them way up into the air. So we were getting a big influx also of life from Canada as well as the smoke was coming along.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. Let's give Mr. Zimmer another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
If anyone would like to purchase a copy of Air-Borne, we have several over here. And please just line up in a congenial manner. Thank you so much for coming out.